The galaxy had a word for what happened when a species reached the threshold. That moment when their biology crossed from interesting to dangerous. The Vethkari called it the kindling. Most species burned out before it meant anything. Most species discovered fire and promptly used it on each other until they were ash and cautionary tale. Humanity was different. Humanity had already found fire. They had used it on each other for 10,000 years, and they were still here. Specialist Alara Moss understood this in the way that soldiers understand things, not as philosophy but as operational fact. She understood it at 0400, boots in 2 inches of red Vethkari mud, the sky above the Ranith Valley lit by something that had no business being in, the atmosphere. She understood it as she pressed herself flat behind a collapsed wall and listened to the distant, rhythmic thud of the siege construct's footsteps work through the earth and up through her sternum. The construct had been walking for 6 hours. It had not stopped to rest. "Status," she said quietly, not looking away from the gap in the masonry she was using as a sightline. Behind her, she heard Sergeant Orlin Brace shift his weight. He was a big man, built like someone had stacked sandbags on top of other sandbags and then taught the pile to swear. 600 meters, he said, give or take. It changed direction again. It's not following any of the drone signals. Because it isn't following signals. Alara finally turned. The fire in the valley had painted orange streaks across the left side of her face, and in that light her expression was something between exhausted and thoughtful. "It's following us." Brace looked at her. "You specifically," she said. "It has been since we crossed the river." There were 4 of them left in the team: Brace, Corporal Una Seath, and Warrant Officer Dae-Jin Park, who was sitting against the far wall with his knee braced and his lips pressed to a thin, pale line. Park had taken shrapnel from the secondary detonation 3 hours ago. He hadn't complained once. Alara had considered this at various points, both admirable and deeply concerning. "Command," she said. Seath held out the comm unit. The speaker crackled with what might have been a voice in another life. "Relays down past the ridge," she said. "We're on our own. On your own." Alara turned back to the gap in the wall. 600 meters. The construct was an oblate thing, like someone had taken the concept of a tank and inflated it to the size of a large building, and then replaced everything you expected to see. Wheels, treads, a human silhouette at any window, with interlocking plates of the Vethkari bio, resin that glittered in firelight like beetle shells. It moved on 6 articulated limbs, each one thicker than a municipal transport. It had no visible weapons. It didn't need them. It had mass and momentum and a power source that human engineers had spent 8 months trying to understand and failed. They called it the Avalanche. It had destroyed 3 fortified positions in the last 72 hours. Not destroyed in the sense of breached or damaged. Destroyed in the sense that the positions no longer existed in any meaningful form. And it was 600 meters away and moving toward them, and the 4 of them were crouched in the rubble of what had been a forward supply depot, and Alara was the ranking officer, and she was looking at the thing and doing math. "We have the demo charges from the depot," Brace said. He'd read her silence correctly, the way good sergeants do. 12 of the AP9s if we can get underneath it. "Not enough," Alara said. "The joint between the 4th and 5th limb on the left side," he said. "That's where the articulation housing is." Intelligence said a lot of things about this unit. She watched it move. There was something almost meditative about the way it walked, each limb placing itself with deliberate precision. Intelligence also said it couldn't track targets through electromagnetic countermeasures. "We've been running countermeasures for 4 hours. Silence. So it found us another way," Seath said. "Vibration," Park said from the wall, his voice careful and unhurried. "It's reading ground vibration. That's why it's changed course when we moved the comm unit. We thought it was following the signal, but it was just noting the footstep pattern that came with the signal. It's been building a model of us. How we move, how we breathe, how we distribute our weight." A pause. "It's a very patient machine." Everyone looked at Park. "My father was a seismologist," he said by way of explanation. Alara turned back to the gap in the wall, 600 meters. In the valley, she could see the orange bloom of one of the human field positions still burning. She let herself look at it for 2 full seconds, and then she filed whatever she felt about it somewhere it wouldn't interfere with the next 10 minutes. "All right," she said, "here's what we're going to do." 4 years earlier, Alara Moss had been a postdoctoral researcher in materials engineering at a university in the flatlands south of what used to be called the Midwest, studying the fatigue behavior of composite alloys under cyclic stress. She had published 4 papers. She had a cat named Theorem. She had held the vague, comfortable ambition of tenure and long summers and enough research funding to keep asking interesting questions. Then the Vethkari arrived. Not crashed, not invaded, arrived. That was the thing people got wrong. Still, even after 4 years, the Vethkari hadn't come in shooting. They'd come in requesting. They transmitted on every wavelength simultaneously, in a language that took the combined effort of 12 universities 18 months to partially decode. A message that boiled down to, your world is in our cataloged space. We did not anticipate your level of development. We require negotiation. Humanity has spent 14 months negotiating. At the end of those 14 months, the Vethkari had presented their terms. Humans would continue to exist in a designated zone. They would be managed. They would not expand. In exchange, the Vethkari would not reduce the planet to its component minerals, which was the standard procedure for cataloged worlds that had produced no spacefaring civilization and were therefore simply resource deposits. The problem, from the Vethkari perspective, was that humanity had not quite reached spacefaring status. They were right on the edge of it. The probes sent to the outer system, the orbital platforms, the moon installations, all of this was, in the Vethkari framework, the equivalent of a child who had learned to climb the stairs but had not yet managed the door. Not quite qualifying for full protected status under Interstellar Compact, but inconveniently close. The second problem was that humanity's response to the terms was a categorical and creative refusal that the Vethkari diplomatic corps had, apparently, never encountered before. Every species that reached negotiation either accepted the terms or sued for mercy. No species had ever responded with a 17-page document outlining why the terms were legally problematic, ethically indefensible, and also somewhat rude. The war had started roughly 6 weeks after that document was delivered. Alara had joined not because she was military, not because she was brave in any classical sense, but because she was an engineer, and the military was consuming engineers with a desperation that bordered on frantic, and because she had looked at the situation, at the Vethkari hardware and the timelines and the projections, and decided that the alternative to trying was not appealing. She had been good at trying. It turned out that the skills required to understand why composite alloys failed under stress were useful for other kinds of stress. She had been promoted 3 times in 18 months. She commanded a small unit of people who were all like her, deeply unsuited to warfare in the classical sense, and deeply suited to the kind of problem-solving that warfare in the current sense required. She had not seen Theorem since the first winter. She'd left him with her neighbor, Mrs. Adekunnel, and Mrs. Adekunnel had written her twice. The letters were in a waterproof pouch in her kit. She thought about that sometimes in the moments between things, the way the ordinary world maintained its weight even while it receded. The plan was simple. That was the thing about good plans under fire. They had to be simple because complexity was the enemy of execution, and execution was the only thing that kept you alive. The avalanche was reading ground vibration. They would give it ground vibration to read. Brace would move south, heavy-footed, stumbling slightly, the way a large man under load would stumble, generating the signature of someone carrying equipment. He would arc wide, toward the remains of the motor pool on the eastern side of the depot, where the burning vehicles would mask his thermal signature. He would place the demo charges on a timer, then he would leave. Seath would move east, staying low, toward the dry creek bed that cut under the perimeter wall. She would generate a different vibration signature, lighter, faster, the pattern of someone retreating under urgent pressure. Alara would not move at all. She would stay exactly where she was. Weight distributed the way a person waits rather than the way a person hides. Because people who are waiting generate different microtremors from people who are hiding, and she had to trust that this was true and that the machine was reading it that way. Park would tell her if she was wrong, and then they would not have time to do much else, but at least she would know. 30 seconds to Brace's first movement, Seath said, looking at her watch. Park, Alara said, how are you doing? Fine, Park said. Your definition of fine has historically covered a significant range. A pause. I can move when required. Good. She looked at the gap in the wall. The avalanche was still advancing on the same bearing, slow and implacable, each footfall sending a shudder through the ground. It's going to work, she said. You don't know that, Brace said. No, she said. But I'm going to act like I do, and so are you. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then he moved. What Alara knew about the Vethkari and their machines, what she had learned in 4, Years of studying them, fighting them, picking apart the wreckage they left, and trying to understand the thinking underneath was this. They were extraordinarily good at refinement, at iteration, at taking a thing that worked and making it work better, with smaller margins, with tighter tolerances, until it was nearly perfect. What they were not, as far as she could tell, was good at novelty. When the Vethkari encountered a new problem, they solved it. Then they filed the solution. Then, the next time they encountered that problem or anything sufficiently like it, they retrieved the solution and applied it. Their history was a library of solved problems, and they were very confident in their library. Humanity's history was also a library, but it was less organized, and many of the entries contradicted each other, and a significant portion of it was people discovering that the solution to the last problem had created a new problem, and then solving that, and so on in an endless chain of consequence and improvisation that was not, strictly speaking, efficient. But it was adaptive. Brace had been moving for 4 minutes. The avalanche had shifted course slightly, tracking him, and the change in bearing confirmed what Park had said about the vibration sensing. Seath had moved 2 minutes ago. Alara hadn't watched her go, trusting her peripheral awareness of the sound and the absence that followed. Alara herself was still. The cold of the rubble was in her knees. The orange fire in the valley had dropped slightly, some section of it burning down to ember and ash. She breathed evenly, in and out, the way her instructor in the first winter had taught her. The way that kept your hands from shaking and kept your mind on the problem in front of you rather than the aggregate of all the problems behind and ahead. The avalanche was 400 meters out, 350. The ground shudder was constant now, a deep bass D frequency she could feel in her molars. It hasn't changed direction again, Park said quietly. No. It's focused on Brace. Yes, he needs to be farther from the charges when they go. He knows. A pause. Does he know how fast that thing can change direction if it identifies a secondary target? Yes, Alara said. He knows that too. The avalanche passed 200 meters north-northwest. She watched it through the gap in the wall, that vast carapace moving in the orange-lit dark, silent except for the percussion of its footfalls and the occasional creak of its shell plates, expanding and contracting with the heat of its power core. Up close, it was even larger than the field estimates had suggested. It was larger than the building she'd done her doctoral work in. It was, she thought, genuinely impressive, in the way that a geological event was impressive. Not because anyone had tried to make it impressive, but because the raw scale of a thing could be, affecting even when you were on the wrong end of it. 300 meters to the motor pool, Park said. Brace, she said into the calm, barely above a whisper. Moving, he said, no other words. She listened to the avalanche footfalls recede northward. She felt the moment shift, not a sound, not a sight, something subtler, the feeling of a window opening, and she said, Park, move. She heard him get up, the hiss of pain through his teeth, controlled, mostly suppressed, his footsteps as he went north along the wall. She gave him 8 seconds, and then she stood and moved the other way, east-southeast, toward the creek bed where Seath had gone. Behind her, to the north, the demolition charges detonated. The sound was enormous, and then the concussive wave arrived half a second later, and she was already moving, the rubble skittering and jumping under the pressure front, and when she looked back there was a column of white-yellow fire climbing into the sky from the motor pool, and the avalanche's silhouette was visible against it, still standing, still intact, but stopped. Stopped, not destroyed. But the articulation housing on the left side, the joint between the 4th and 5th limb, had taken shrapnel from 2 of the charges Brace had managed to position against the depot's fuel stores, and the left side rear limb was dragging now, the smooth mechanical precision of its movement interrupted by a grinding that she could hear even at this distance. 1 limb, out of 6, she ran. The Vethkari had a saying that their interpreters had eventually managed to translate, though the translation was imperfect. It referred to the characteristic behavior of a prey species facing a predator, the freezing response, the fugue state, the biological betrayal that rendered an organism helpless at exactly the moment motion mattered most. In Vethkari, the phrase was something close to, the small thing that forgets it was born moving. They used this phrase a great deal in their tactical assessments of human behavior during the first months of the war. They noted, repeatedly, the tendency of human units to hesitate at decisive moments. They cataloged it. They built tactical models around it. What they did not adequately catalog was what happened to humans after the first hesitation. Alara reached the creek bed and slid down the bank, landing in 6 inches of cold water and ice gravel, and found Seath crouched in the shadow of the bank holding the relay transceiver she'd spent 40 minutes repairing with 2 screws and a piece of copper taken from a dead drone. "We have partial signal," Seath said. "It's not stable." "Does command know where we are?" "They know approximately where we were 20 minutes ago." "Close enough." Alara took the transceiver. She switched to the emergency burst frequency and held down the key for the pattern that meant unit compromised, position vulnerable, require extraction or instruction. She held it for 5 full seconds and then released it and waited. Static, more static, and then, through the static, 3 clicks. The acknowledge pattern. "They hear us," she said. "That's nice," Brace said. He'd appeared at the top of the creek bank without any dramatic announcement, which was very much his style. He slid down with the controlled economy of a man managing weight on a bad knee, which meant that Park had found him and they'd compared injuries somewhere in the smoke. "What are they going to do about it?" "Something," Alara said. "Something useful. You don't know that either." "No," she said, "but I'm acting like I do." He looked at her for a moment, and then he sat down heavily on the creek bank, and she was fairly sure she heard him almost laugh again. Behind him, Park appeared at the top of the bank and made his way down with considerably more difficulty and considerably less complaint. "The avalanche is stationary," Park said. "It's been stationary for 4 minutes. "Damaged limb," Alara said. "Possibly. Or it's recalibrating its targeting solution. It may have lost our vibration signatures in the detonation noise. It will rebuild a model, but it will take time." "How much time?" Park considered this with the careful expression of a man who was used to being asked questions he couldn't fully answer and had developed over time a principled relationship with uncertainty. "Enough," he said. "Probably." "Probably," Brace muttered. "The error range on the unknowns is large," Park said, not unkindly. "If I said definitely, I would be lying." "If you said definitely, I would be suspicious," Alara said. They sat in the creek in the cold dark and the sound of burning, and somewhere above them the Vethkari avalanche was very still and thinking in a way that no human had yet fully characterized, and the 4 of them waited for the window. The window came 90 minutes later in the form of a Theta-class drop vehicle, old, much repaired, the kind of hardware that had been resurrected from a dozen different scrapyards and made to function through the accumulated ingenuity of people who had no budget and too much need. It came in low and fast from the southeast, running no lights, and it was the ugliest thing Alara had seen in months, and she loved it immediately. They moved for the landing zone in the field north of the creek. All 4 of them, Brace and Park keeping pace together, the sound of the avalanche resuming movement behind them. It had recalibrated, apparently, and found them again, or found something in their general direction. But the drop vehicle was there, and the ramp was down, and the flight crew was shouting something over the engine noise that was almost certainly language, and they were aboard, and the ramp was rising, and the vehicle was climbing, at an angle that pressed Alara into the deck plating before she had fully decided to sit down. She lay on the cold metal and looked up at the overhead of the personnel bay, which was scrawled with 8 months of unit markers and bad jokes, and at least 2 marriage proposals and 1 philosophical question. Why do frogs? That would apparently never be answered. And she let herself breathe. "Moss," Brace said from somewhere to her left. "Yeah. What was the demo charge placement for?" "We took the fuel stores out, but we didn't actually damage the construct. Not critically." She considered this. "No, so what was the point?" "Stop it," she said. "For long enough." "For long enough to do what?" "We just ran. We needed 90 minutes for command to get a window on our location and get a vehicle here." She closed her eyes. "Stopping it bought us 90 minutes. A pause. We could have just run and hidden. It would have found us. It had our vibration signature. It needed something big enough to disrupt its sensor model and force a recalibration." She paused. "The fuel stores were loud enough." Brace was quiet for a moment. "Then so you blew up an entire fuel depot to buy yourself 90 minutes. "Yes, that's either very clever or very expensive." "Both," Park said from the far side of the bay. "It's usually both." The forward command at Raneth Ridge was a collection of repurposed structures and prefabricated shelters built into the leeward face of a hill that had been carefully selected for its radar shadow and carefully fortified with the kind of half measures that made experienced engineers wince and inexperienced ones optimistic. Alara had been through it twice before, and both times she'd come away with a list of structural improvements she'd never had time to implement and an appreciation for the fact that it was still standing at all. She debriefed in a room that smelled of recycled air and cold coffee, sitting across from a colonel named Hata, who had the specific kind of tiredness that lived in the eyes and not the posture, the tiredness of someone who had decided some time ago that they were not going to let their face show what the inside of their head was doing. She recognized it. She saw it in the mirror. "The avalanche is mobile again," Colonel Hata said. "Northern sweep heading toward the Yun 7 position. We need to warn them about the vibration sensing. Message is already sent." He looked at her debrief notes. "You determined this from field observation." "Park did. Park is a warrant officer with a materials background. His father was a seismologist," Alara said. "The information was there. He assembled it." Hata made a note. It was, she had come to understand, a characteristic gesture of his. Not that he had to write things down to remember them, but that the act of writing something meant he'd decided it was real and worth responding to. "The Vethkari are deploying 3 more Avalanche-class units in the eastern sector," he said. She looked at him. "Confirmed as of 6 hours ago," he said. "Intelligence analysis suggests they're moving to a consolidation phase. They believe the current human positions in the Eastern Theater are, their word, in translation, unsustainable." 3 more, she said. "Yes." The room was quiet. Outside she could hear the low sound of activity in the command shelter, voices, equipment, the distant percussion of something that wasn't quite thunder. "They're not wrong," she said, "about the current positions." "No," Hata agreed. "They're not wrong. But they're thinking about sustainability the way they always think about it." She leaned forward slightly. "In terms of attrition, in terms of resource depletion, hold the positions until humans run out of something. Ammunition, people, will. The Vethkari have been doing this kind of war for a very long time, and it always works the same way eventually." "You have a different thought," Hata said, and it was not a question. "The vibration sensing on the avalanche unit," she said. "That's not in any intelligence briefing I've seen. That's a field modification. Something their engineers added recently, probably after standard countermeasures started degrading their targeting solutions." She paused. "They're adapting, yes, but they're adapting to us. They're looking at what we do and modifying their systems to close the gap." She paused. "Which means their systems have gaps." Hata set down his pen. "Moss. They've been doing war the same way for a very long time," she said. "That means they're good at it. But it also means they have a library of solutions and they're working from the library. They see a problem and they find the entry that matches it best. They found an entry for countermeasures, vibration sensing. They'll find entries for other things we try. And we need to do things that aren't in the library." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's either a strategy or a wish." "It's both," she said. "It's usually both." Park said something like that. She slept for 5 hours on a cot in the secondary shelter, dreamless in the way that deep exhaustion produces. Not rest, exactly, but the absence of any processing, a hard shutdown of the cognitive systems that had been running continuously for 30-some hours. She woke to a hand on her shoulder and a corporal she didn't know holding a mug of coffee that smelled like coffee in the way that very specific military beverages smelled like coffee, technically accurate, spiritually aspirational. "Colonel Hata wants you," the corporal said. "When?" Now was the impression I got. She drank the coffee standing up and went to find him. He was in the operations center with 2 other officers she recognized. Major Vasquez from Signals Intelligence and Dr. Amara Osei, who was technically a civilian and technically a xenobiologist, and who spent most of her time in a state of barely controlled intellectual excitement that the military environment had not entirely suppressed. Osei was looking at a display with a specific expression of someone who has found something they didn't expect to find and is still deciding whether it is wonderful or terrible. "Tell her," Hata said. "There is a structure in the southern sector," Osei said, pulling the display toward Alara. "Here. A point on the map, 240 kilometers south of the current forward position, in the foothills where the valley opened into the coastal plain. The Vethkari have been occupying it since the 2nd week of the campaign. We initially classified it as a staging depot. It has the right thermal signature for equipment storage and the access patterns we'd expect from a logistics hub." "Initially," Alara said. "The signal traffic we've been capturing from that location doesn't match a depot," Vasquez said. "It matches a command relay. More specifically, it matches the kind of traffic you'd expect from a unit managing a distributed sensor network." Alara looked at the point on the map. "The avalanche units in the Eastern Theater," Osei said, her voice careful and precise, and not quite able to contain the electricity underneath it. are not self-directing. They have the capacity for self-direction, the vibration sensing, the adaptive targeting, but they're doing something more sophisticated than that. They're sharing targeting data. All 4 units are contributing to a single sensor model of the battlefield, and that model is being processed and redistributed from this location. The room was quiet. A network, Alara said. A network, Osi confirmed. One that relies on very high bandwidth data relay between units. The individual construct's internal processing is limited. Good at one thing, good at refining that one thing. Very good at applying known solutions to known problems. But collectively, connected through this relay, they can construct a picture of the battlefield that no individual unit could manage. They can track more targets than any one unit could hold in its processing. They can share calibration data. They can distribute the task of building new sensor models across multiple units simultaneously. So when I disrupted the avalanche's vibration signature model, Alara said slowly, I wasn't just disrupting that unit. You disrupted a shared calibration that all 4 units were contributing to, Vasquez said. You may have bought more time than you realized. And if the relay goes down, the individual units default to their last known sensor state, Osi said. They can still operate, they're not blind, but they lose the collective refinement. They lose the ability to build new solutions as fast. They're operating from the library instead of updating it in real time. Alara looked at the map for a long time. 240 kilometers through contested territory, past Vethkari patrol lines, to a structure that was being protected by the most capable alien military technology she had ever encountered, to take down a relay that the Vethkari had no reason to believe humans even knew existed. They won't expect this, she said. No, Hada said. They won't, because nothing in their library covers it. She looked at him. He was looking back with the particular expression of a commanding officer who has already made a decision and wants to see if the person he's briefing will arrive at the same decision independently. How many people, she asked. Small, he said. Small enough to move without being tracked. Small enough that losing the unit doesn't compromise other operations. Small enough that if it fails, it was a probe and not a strategy. That too. She breathed out slowly. Who, he told her. 3 days later, she was lying in the red mud of a hillside 30 kilometers north of the relay station, counting exhaust signatures through a scope, and she was thinking about the word library. The Vethkari were excellent at libraries. They were excellent at storing and retrieving and applying accumulated knowledge. In 4 years of war, she had never once seen them do something genuinely surprising, which was a remarkable thing to say about beings who had crossed interstellar distances and built machines like the Avalanche. They had done all of that, but they had done it with patience and refinement and iteration, each new capability grown from previous capabilities, each solution evolved from prior solutions. They were very, very good. Humanity was not excellent at libraries. Humanity was excellent at something messier, something less catalogable. The moment when a problem became unbearable enough that someone stopped looking for the right answer and started inventing answers that had never existed before. There were 6 people on the slope with her. Brace, because she had asked for Brace. Seath, because Seath was the best signals operator she'd worked with. Park, because his knee was acceptable, and because she had come to depend on his specific quality of calm. 3 others, Chen, Abara, Otieno, who had been assigned to the unit in the weeks before and who had demonstrated, in the evaluation exercises she'd run in the interim, the particular combination of competence and flexibility that this kind of operation required. Patrol cycle, Chen said. She was 23 and had been an undergraduate philosophy student before the war and had joined the combat engineering corps with a thoroughness of commitment that had initially surprised and eventually made complete sense to Alara. 11 minutes, Seath said, not looking up from the scope. Maybe 12. The northern route has variable timing. Why? The patrol unit changes speed when it passes the 3rd antenna tower. Same place every time. Possibly a localized interference that disrupts their internal timing system. Possibly a behavioral habit we haven't fully explained yet. Does it matter which one? Alara asked. No, Seath said. Gives us 11 to 12 minutes at the fence line regardless. The relay station was not visually impressive. This was, in its way, a kind of camouflage. The Vethkari had built it to look like another logistic structure, and they had done a thorough job of it. The external appearance matched everything in the intelligence databases about Vethkari depot construction. The thermal signatures, the access patterns, the placement of external equipment, All of it was plausible and unremarkable. But signals traffic didn't lie the way architecture did. And Vasquez had been patient and careful. And here they were. The fence line was a Vethkari contact perimeter. Not a physical barrier, but a sensor boundary. A continuous feed monitoring line that detected vibration, thermal variation, and optical intrusion. Standard installation. Standard response protocol. Alert to the nearest response unit, which in this case was approximately 4 kilometers to the east and would arrive in, at current mobility rates, 6 minutes, 11 minutes of access, 6 minutes to response. A margin of 5 minutes that felt very different in a briefing room than it felt in the mud on a hillside. 2-person breach and access, Alara said. Seath and I go in. The rest hold the perimeter. If the timeline goes wrong, you hear about it because the station stops relaying, not because we tell you. And if something else goes wrong, Brace said. Same answer, she said. He didn't argue. This was one of the things about Brace. He argued when arguing was useful, and then he stopped. Perimeter, she said, and they moved. Getting through the sensor perimeter required the same reasoning that had stopped the avalanche in the motor pool. Not defeating the sensor, but giving the sensor something to read that wasn't a threat. The contact perimeter was calibrated to detect patterns associated with living, organisms moving with intent, a profile assembled from data the Vethkari had collected over years of this campaign and calibrated very precisely. It was not calibrated for organisms that were not moving with intent. Alara and Seath moved like the hillside moved, in the pauses between wind, gusts, in the intervals when the ambient thermal signature of the ground was shifting naturally, in the micro windows when every natural variable was pointing slightly away from the perimeter's attention. This had taken 3 hours of observation to map. It was not a technique from any doctrine. It was something Alara had worked out from first principles, starting with what she knew about how sensor systems were designed and working backward to how you moved through them. She had, somewhere, the ghost of a feeling she'd had in graduate school, working at a whiteboard late at night when the building was empty, the specific pleasure of a problem yielding to the right question. They reached the outer wall of the structure. Seath had the access tools and she was fast and quiet, and the secondary port opened in 40 seconds. A maintenance access that the Vethkari used for routine equipment checks and that they had not, in the briefings Alara had studied, ever considered as a potential breach point because no human force in this theater had ever attempted access to a station this deep in the defensive perimeter. Inside was warm and humming. The equipment was Vethkari, smooth, organic-looking. The bioresin construction that ran through all their technology, racks of processing nodes that looked more like coral than machinery, the blue-white light of active data transfer cycling through the network paths. The sound was continuous and low, a frequency that sat at the edge of hearing and produced, after a few seconds, a slight disorientation that Alara had been briefed on and had practiced through and which she set aside. 3 minutes, she said quietly. Seath was already moving. The package they'd built in the 48 hours before departure was a physical unit, a transmitter, technically, but transmitting noise rather than signal, calibrated to the specific frequencies the relay used for its inter-unit communication. It wouldn't destroy the relay. It wouldn't even look like an attack to the system's monitoring. It would look like a very localized signal degradation, the kind of thing that happened when power fluctuated or cooling failed, or any of a dozen benign causes. The relay's systems would attempt to compensate. They would compensate at the expense of the shared sensor network the avalanche units depended on. The shared calibration data would degrade. The collective picture would fragment. 4 large and dangerous machines would be left operating on stale data and their own limited processing. Not blind, not helpless, but cut off from the library. Seath placed the unit and initiated the connection sequence and looked up. 2 minutes. Good. It'll take 6 to 8 hours before the degradation is detectable as a pattern, before they identify a cause. That's the window, Alara said. That's when the assault on the eastern positions happens. 6 to 8 hours of the avalanche units operating degraded. And confused, Alara said. They're used to a certain quality of information. When that quality drops and they can't identify why, the adaptive systems will spend processing cycles trying to correct for it rather than tracking targets. She paused. It's the wrong answer to the wrong problem, but it's the answer the library will produce. Seath looked at her for a moment. How do you know that? I don't, Alara said. I'm acting like I do. For the first time in the entire operation, Seath smiled. It was a small, slightly exhausted smile. The kind that surfaces when something has been funny for too long to be anything else. Right, she said. Let's get out. They got out. The patrol cycle gave them 11.5 minutes. They were back past the sensor perimeter in 8. They moved north up the slope and rejoined the team in the shadow of a rocky outcrop, and Alara called in the success report on the emergency relay in a burst sequence so compressed it would look like atmospheric noise to the Vethkari intercept protocols. Now we wait, Brace said. Now we move, Alara corrected. Waiting is stationary. Stationary is how you get found. Right, he said. We move to a different location and then wait. Yes, she said. Exactly. The assault on the Eastern Theater positions began 4 hours after the package was activated. The timing had been advanced by 2 hours. A decision at the command level that Alara found out about later, based on intelligence suggesting the Vethkari were planning to move the avalanche units overnight. Earlier was riskier but better. She was 20 kilometers north of the relay station when it started, listening to the tactical channel through Seath's rebuilt relay, and she heard in the communications the shape of what was happening. Not the individual actions, but the architecture of them, the way things that had been going one way were starting to go another. The avalanche units were responding slowly. That was in the reports. Response times 3 times normal. Target acquisition and tracking degraded across all 4 units. The collective sensor model that had given them the ability to project human movement patterns and pre-position against them was fragmenting, pieces of it stale, pieces contradicting each other, the system doing exactly what Alara had predicted, trying to compensate for signal degradation by querying its own cached data and finding it insufficient, cycling through corrections that addressed the wrong problem. There were people dying in that fight. She was under no illusions about that. This was not a clean thing, this operation. Nothing about the last 4 years had been clean, and the Eastern assault was not surgical even with the degraded avalanche response. People were dying. The margin they had created was real, and it was being used, and it was not cost-free. She sat with that. She held it. This was the thing she had learned that hadn't been in any of the military manuals she'd studied in the early weeks. That command responsibility was not the absence of cost, but the willingness to know the cost precisely and carry it accurately. Not to make it light, not to make it heavy, to carry it at its actual weight. Signal from the ridge, Park said, looking up from the receiver. Eastern position held. Avalanche units withdrawing, she breathed out. 3 of them withdrew, Park said. The 4th is still engaged, but it's reported as combat ineffective by the on-site observers. They've isolated it. How? It's navigating toward the noise rather than the targets, Park said. His voice had the careful quality it always had. The seismologist's son reading what the ground was saying. When its sensor model is uncertain, it's defaulting to the loudest vibration source in the area, which is the combat itself. It keeps moving toward the fight, but it can't identify specific targets in the noise. Alara looked up at the sky. Dawn was coming, the eastern horizon graying, the stars thinning. They'll repair the relay, she said. Yes, Park said, in time. We'll need something else by then. Yes, he said, we will. She thought about the library. She thought about the way the Vethkari had looked at humanity 4 years ago. A species right at the threshold, almost spacefaring, catalogued in their database under a category that was neither protected nor ignored, but something in between, something that had no real precedent. She thought about what it had meant to them that the 17-page document hadn't matched any expected response pattern, the consternation that must have produced. The way they would have searched the library for the nearest equivalent and found it inadequate. They were still searching. 4 years later, they were still trying to find the right catalog entry for what humans did when they were cornered. The entry didn't exist, that was the thing. Not because humans were special in some cosmic sense. There was nothing mystical about it. But because the library had been built from species that, when cornered, had either surrendered or collapsed. The Vethkari had never encountered a species that, when cornered, started inventing. There was a long way to go still. Alara knew that clearly. 1 operation, 1 degraded relay, 4 avalanche units briefly confused. This was not victory. This was the proof of a principle. The first experimental result in what would have to be a very long series of experiments. But the principle was sound. She was fairly confident of that. Come on, she said, standing up. We have a long way back. The walk back north took 2 days. They moved carefully, resting in daylight, and moving in the dark hours when Vethkari patrol craft were less active and the terrain gave more cover. The highland country they were crossing had been, before the war, a region of farms and small towns. It had been evacuated in the first winter of the campaign, and it had that particular quality that abandoned landscapes had. Not quite natural, not quite human, the marks of both still present, but neither one currently tending to the other. Alara passed through what had been a market town. The signage was still up in some places. A bakery, a bookshop, a hardware store whose window display remained intact inexplicably, the tools still arranged in their seasonal pattern, whatever season had been current when the window dresser last came. She looked at it for a moment. "What?" Brace said behind her. "Nothing," she said, "just looking." She looked at the tools in the window, hammers and levels, and the long-handled things whose names she could remember from her neighbor's tool shed as a child. And she thought about her apartment and Theorem and Mrs. Adekama's letters in the waterproof pouch. She thought about the lab, the whiteboards, the specific smell of the fabrication space where she'd done her materials testing, the way a good experimental result felt in your hands when you held the data printout and turned it over and found it true. She thought about what it meant that she was standing here. There was grief in it, a real and specific grief for the world that had existed before. She didn't deny that. But underneath the grief was something else, something she hadn't had a word for in the first months and had gradually found a word for, in the way you gradually find the right word for something you've been experiencing without naming. The word was belonging. Not to the war, not to the military, not even to this specific team of people, though she would have, and had, done a great deal for this specific team of people. Belonging to the problem. The specific human belonging to the problem you could not leave alone. She had never been able to leave a problem alone. She supposed she still couldn't. She turned away from the window and walked north. The debrief at Raneth Ridge was thorough and detailed and lasted 9 hours spread across 2 days, broken up by the intervals necessary for documentation and for the kind of technical deep dive that OC and Vasquez conducted, going through every piece of observation and every decision point with the thoroughness of people who understood that what had been learned in this operation was more valuable than the operation itself. Haida was there for parts of it, listening more than speaking, which was his characteristic mode when information was being assembled rather than decisions made. On the second day, after the technical review, he called her in separately. Coffee again, the same room, the same smell of recycled air. He looked more tired than the last time, and better in some way she couldn't precisely name. A slight clarification in the eyes, maybe. The look of someone who has had one question answered and is still living with the others. The Eastern Command wants to expand the relay disruption approach, he said. They want a team working on a systematic targeting of Veth-Kari relay infrastructure across the whole theater. It won't stay effective indefinitely, Alara said. Once they identify the pattern of disruption, they'll find a solution for it. How long? I don't know. Weeks, possibly. Less if we're too systematic. More if we vary the approach enough that each incident looks different from the last. She paused. The point isn't to do the same thing repeatedly. The point is to keep doing new things. The point, Hoda said, is to never let them build an adequate catalog entry.
Yes.
He nodded slowly. The Veth-Kari Command has issued a new field assessment of human tactical behavior, he said. Intelligence intercepted it 12 hours ago. OC and Vasquez have a partial translation. What does it say? He looked at her for a moment. Then he slid a single page across the table, the translation excerpt, heavily annotated. The Veth-Kari text, as translated, described a concerning anomaly in the human tactical profile. It noted that human units were demonstrating a pattern of adaptive response that did not conform to expected parameters. It noted, in specific, that human tactical innovation appeared to accelerate in adverse conditions rather than degrade, contrary to predictions derived from historical species behavior models. The final sentence of the excerpt read in OC's translation. The humans are not responding to containment as contained species respond. Further assessment is required. Alara read it twice. Then she set the paper down. They're updating the catalog, she said. Yes, Hada said. For the first time in the campaign, they're updating it rather than applying it. She thought about what that meant. The Veth-Kari, confronted with something that didn't fit their library, were doing what any rational intelligence does, generating new data, building a better model. The adaptive response that had, until now, been a tactical advantage for the human forces, the strangeness, the novelty, the gap between what the library predicted and what humans actually did, was beginning to close as the Vethkari collected evidence and built a better picture. This was, Alara thought, the shape of the real problem, not any specific engagement, not the avalanche units or the relay stations or the sensor networks. The real problem was the information contest. Could humans generate novelty faster than the Vethkari could categorize it? We need to go faster, she said. Yes, Hada said, significantly faster. And we need more people who think the way. She paused. The way our team thinks, the way Park thinks, the way Chen thinks. Non-military backgrounds. People who've spent their lives being confronted with problems and building solutions that didn't exist before. Researchers, Hada said. Engineers, biologists. People who've spent careers in domains the Vethkari have no category for, because the Vethkari have never had to understand how humans conduct research. The way we approach an unknown question. The way we, she stopped. What? Hada said. The way we argue with our data, she said slowly. The Vethkari are updating their model, but they're updating it the way they update everything, by adding observations to the existing framework and refining the predictions. They're very good at that. But the framework itself, she paused. The framework assumes that tactical behavior follows optimization curves, that a species will become more efficient and more predictable over time as it learns the constraints of its operating environment. That's what their historical species behavior models are built on. And humans don't follow optimization curves, Hada said. Humans follow optimization curves and then, periodically, throw the optimization out and do something entirely unprecedented. And then build a new optimization curve from there and then throw that out too. She leaned forward. We call it discovery. We've been doing it for tens of thousands of years. We have entire institutions whose only purpose is to generate ideas that have never existed before. It's what I did before. It's what half the people I know did before. Can it be applied, Hada said carefully, to warfare? It's what we've been doing, she said. The relay disruption, the vibration analysis. Every operational novelty we've generated in this campaign, it's applied research. It's the same cognitive process. She paused. We just need to be more systematic about it. Systematic novelty, Hada said. Is that not a contradiction? It's the contradiction we live in, she said. It's what we are. But first, there was still a war to get through. The weeks after Ranith Ridge were the hardest of Alara's command career, and she had had some hard ones. Command had approved the expanded relay disruption concept in principle, which meant in practice that she was being asked to design and execute operations at a tempo that was strictly speaking impossible, and that they were doing anyway. The working group was theoretical at this point, 3 people in a room, and the operations were running on the same 4-person team that had crawled through Vethkari sensor perimeters twice already. Park's knee was properly assessed by the medical officer at the ridge and was described as functional with the specific professional neutrality of medical officers who are telling you something is worse than it sounds. He kept working. He did not accept the suggestion that he stand down, and he did not make a fuss about this, and Alara noted both facts and moved on. The second relay disruption happened 12 days after the first, at a station 60 kilometers east of the original target, and it followed broadly similar lines with the specific modifications that Chen had suggested based on the first operation's timeline data. The third happened 3 days after that, in the far northern edge of the theater, which required a transit through terrain that was, in the honest assessment of every mapping tool they had, deeply unsuitable for a 4-person, covert team carrying the equipment they were carrying in the weather that was occurring. They did it anyway. By the 4th operation, they had Park's acoustic analysis approach refined to the point where Brace could execute it without talking about it, just moved through terrain, with the specific deliberate placement of feet that produced a vibration signature the Vethkari sensor systems read as something other than what it was. By the 5th operation, Seath had developed a secondary signal masking technique that bought them an additional 45 seconds at fence. Lines which sound small and in the context of those fence lines was enormous. They were learning. The Vethkari were also learning, and the gap between the 2 learning curves was the only margin that mattered. And maintaining it required a kind of sustained, relentless forward attention that left very little space for anything else. Alara managed this by organizing her interior experience the way she organized her kit. Everything assigned its place, everything retrievable on demand, nothing loose. She thought about theorem on Tuesday mornings for approximately 5 minutes, which was enough. The 6th operation was the one that nearly didn't work. The station was in a valley that the Vethkari had reinforced significantly following the first 3 disruptions. They had, as anticipated, identified a pattern, and their response to that pattern was a significant increase in patrol density and the deployment of a sensor type they hadn't used in the region before. The new sensor was thermal, not vibration-based, and it was calibrated at a sensitivity level that their pre-mission intelligence had not accurately reflected. Alara found out about the calibration discrepancy 17 minutes into the approach, when Chen's thermal masking equipment registered a response that shouldn't have been there. They stopped. They were in the open approach ground, 40 meters from cover, in a window that was going to close in approximately 4 minutes when the patrol loop brought a Vethkari observation unit around the eastern ridge. "Options," Alara said very quietly. "Back," said Brace. "Same way we came. We'll be visible on the exit. The sensor will track us. Not if we move fast enough that it reads us as atmospheric." "That requires moving very fast," he said. "Yeah. Alternatively," Chen said, "the thermal calibration is sensitive enough to read us, but it's not the same sensor that cues the patrol response. The patrol response is still vibration triggered. If we can clear the thermal sensor's field of view before it accumulates enough data for a confirmed contact." "How long?" Alara said. 90 seconds, maybe less. "We'll be in its field of view for at least that long regardless of direction." "Yes," Chen said, "unless we change what it's reading." Everyone looked at her. "The sensor is calibrated to human thermal signatures," she said. "Specifically, they've built a profile from months of field data. We are, from its perspective, exactly what it's calibrated to find." She paused. "So stop being that." Silence. "The only things in this approach that aren't warm-bodied organisms moving under their own power," she continued, "are the ground, the rocks, and the residual thermal output from the secondary power relay on the eastern face of the station, which was active in the pre-mission imagery and is almost certainly active now." "We can't look like rocks," Brace said. "No," Chen said, "but we can look like the relay's thermal output. If the 4 of us distribute our body heat emissions to match the pattern of a power system exhaust profile rather than a biological movement profile, we give the sensor a false choice. It either reads us as the thing it's not looking for, or it flags an anomaly against its own baseline data." Alara thought about this for approximately 2 seconds. "How do we do that?" "We move like a heat source, not like people. Low to the ground, parallel, not sequential. No individual movement isolation. We breathe in sync. We eliminate the biological movement tells, the individual variation, the offset patterns between people." She paused. "We become, thermally speaking, one object instead of 4 people." "You learned this where?" Brace said. "I didn't," she said. "I just derived it." This was, in Alara's assessment, a very Chen thing to say. They did it. They moved the 40 meters to cover in 73 seconds, flat and parallel, breathing together in a pattern that Seath called out in 2-word intervals. They didn't look like people. They didn't feel like people, in the specific sense that every instinct in Alara's body was screaming that this was wrong, that this was exposed, that people moved differently than this. She overrode the instinct with a calculation. She had, by this point, a significant amount of practice overriding instinct with calculation. The patrol came around the eastern ridge 12 seconds after they reached cover. The sensor did not trigger. Park, from behind a boulder, was doing his careful breathing thing, the seismologist's son, reading what the ground was telling him. He looked up and met Alara's eyes and said nothing. The nothing meant it worked. The 6th operation succeeded. They placed the disruption package and extracted through the sensor window and were 2 kilometers north of the station before the patrol cycle completed a second loop. On the walk back, in the gray pre-morning, Brace fell into step beside her. For a while he said nothing. The terrain was rocky foothills, the kind of landscape that made you lift your feet or pay the cost, and they both did this without having to think about it. "Chen," he said eventually. "Yes," Alara said. "Where did she come from?" "Philosophy undergraduate. Joined the engineering corps in the first winter." "Philosophy," he said. "Yes." A pause. "Makes a kind of sense," he said, which was an assessment she found she agreed with but couldn't quite articulate why. "It makes exactly that kind of sense," she said. The program that grew from that conversation was not called anything dramatic in its early weeks. It was referred to, in internal documents, as the Adaptive Solutions Working Group, which was bureaucratic enough to be uninteresting and accurate enough to be technically correct. It was housed in the logistics complex 200 kilometers north of the front, in a set of converted storage buildings that were warm but not comfortable, and it consumed resources and people and time at a rate that made the conventional military apparatus deeply uneasy. Alara ran it. She did not run it the way she had been trained to run things. She had not, in truth, been trained to run anything, not in a formal sense. She ran it the way she had run research, which was to say, by finding people who were excellent at their specific thing and getting out of the way, and occasionally asking the question that forced two excellent people to talk to each other and discover the intersection they hadn't known they had. Park became the group's primary analyst for Vethkari sensor and mechanical systems. His particular combination of geological intuition and engineering rigor produced, in the first 4 months, 3 distinct operational principles that no military analyst had previously identified. His papers, because he wrote them as papers, because that was the framework he thought in, and no one had told him not to, were dense and precise and contained more novel insight per page than anything else in the intelligence database. Osi was officially a consultant. She was, in practice, the group's theorist of Vethkari cognitive behavior, and her developing model of how their collective intelligence processed novel information was, slowly and then rapidly, the most strategically significant work being done in the entire theater. Chen wrote operational plans. They were not conventional operational plans. They had a quality of lateral thinking that made conventional military reviewers uncomfortable and made Alara quietly, privately pleased. The philosophy background showed Chen thought in terms of what assumptions you were making and what you were doing when you stopped making them. Brace ran training. This was, in some ways, the most surprising thing. Brace, who had been a construction worker before the war and who had never in Alara's experience said anything she'd classify as theoretical, turned out to be extraordinarily good at teaching people to do things they hadn't done before. He was patient. He was concrete. He could take an abstract principle and turn it into a physical action in 6 words or fewer, which was, in Alara's assessment, a genuine talent that the Academy should teach and didn't. Seath ran communications. She was also, in her spare time, building something, a tool, gradually taking shape in her off hours that used the same signal analysis techniques she'd developed to identify the relay station's traffic type. She hadn't explained it fully. Alara had learned to trust Seath's silence on work in progress. The months accumulated. The operations accumulated. Small strikes, some successful, some not. The failures were documented as carefully as the successes, because the failures contained the same information, just differently arranged. The Vethkari adapted. The group adapted faster. The margin was not always large, and it was never comfortable. And there were losses that were in the weight-bearing category of losses, the ones you carried at their full weight and did not set down. But the catalog entry the Vethkari were building for human tactical behavior had a quality that their analysts described in the intercepts Osi translated with increasing frustration. It was never complete. It was always several observations behind. The predictions it generated were close but not right, in the specific way that frustrated an intelligence organization built on precision, not wrong enough to discard, not accurate enough to rely on. The humans were, in the Vethkari intelligence assessment, behaving in a manner that was consistent with a species in the process of discovering itself. Osei had read that phrase twice when it appeared in the intercept translation, and then she had brought it to Alara, and Alara had read it twice. And then they had looked at each other in a way that was not triumphant, but was something adjacent to it. The recognition of an accurate characterization. Yes, Alara thought, that was exactly what they were doing. The operation that the working group designed in its 8th month was not the largest they had run. It was not the most complex. It was not the most violent. In fact, it was designed to minimize direct conflict, which was a principle that still made conventional commanders nervous even after everything they had seen. It was designed around a single vulnerability that Osi's cognitive model had identified, the Vethkari collective intelligence. When presented with a problem it could not categorize, increased its inter-unit communication traffic significantly while it sought a solution. This was in itself harmless, but the increased traffic was detectable, and the pattern of it, the specific way the communication load distributed across their relay network, created a temporary map of their entire communications infrastructure. The window lasted between 11 and 20 minutes, depending on the complexity of the uncategorized input. Seath's tool, the one she had been building quietly for 4 months, was designed to read that pattern and extract the full network map in approximately 8 minutes. One shot, Seath said in the briefing. The pattern is distinctive enough that they'll identify it after the first use. They'll modify, so we get the network map once. And then what, Chen said. Then we know the whole relay network, Osi said. Not just the stations, we've identified all of them. What do we do with that, Brace said. We don't destroy them, Alara said. We use them. Silence. We can transmit on their network, she said. With the full map, we can inject traffic that looks like theirs. We can send them incorrect calibration data, incorrect targeting solutions, incorrect position reports. Not dramatic errors, subtle ones. The kind of errors that accumulate in a system that's trying to refine its model and receiving data that doesn't quite fit. Park leaned forward. You're not going to break their model. You're going to make it worse at exactly the rate that they're trying to improve it. Every time they correct for an error we've introduced, we introduce a new one, Alara said. Every time they update the catalog, we put something in the catalog that isn't true, not obviously, not all at once. They'll find it eventually, Vasquez said. They'll identify the anomalies. Yes, Alara agreed. Eventually, probably in months, not weeks, if we do it carefully. And while they're finding it, Osi said softly, they won't trust their own data. They'll be trying to distinguish between genuine observations and corrupted ones. In a species whose entire tactical framework depends on accurate collective modeling, she paused. That's not just confusion. That's an epistemological crisis. The room was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when everyone present understood the scope of something. Let's be clear about what this is, Alara said. It's not a weapon. It doesn't kill anyone. It is a demonstration, over time and in accumulating effect, that the framework they've been operating from is unreliable. It is. She paused, finding the right word. A refutation. A refutation, Hada repeated from the corner of the room. He'd been quiet for most of the briefing. Of their core assumption, Alara said, that we can be categorized, that we fit in the library. She paused. We're going to show them, in data they trust, using their own instruments and their own infrastructure, that we don't. To trigger the window, they needed to give the Vethkari collective intelligence something it couldn't categorize. Alara had, over 8 months of running the working group, something of a practiced sense of what fit in the Vethkari library and what didn't. The library was strong on direct conflict, strong on conventional evasion, strong on resource denial, strong on signal-based deception. It had no good entries for the 17-page diplomatic refusal, the vibration signature disruption, the maintenance port access, the supply depot demolition that was specifically calibrated to produce a noise window rather than structural damage. All of those were, in their different ways, the same thing. Humans treating a constraint not as a boundary but as a variable. For the trigger, she wanted something that was unmistakably human in a way the library could not parse. Not aggressive, not evasive, not strategic in any frame the Vethkari would recognize. She wanted something that looked to the Vethkari pattern recognition systems like a category error. What she chose was music, or rather she chose the transmission of music at full strength across every radio frequency the Vethkari had identified as human communication channels for a period of 4 minutes. Not military music, not coded signal, not the kind of broadcast that could be rationalized as propaganda or psychological operation. Just music, old music, chosen by the members of the working group in the week before the operation, compiled by Seath onto a transmission package that Park had, with great care, ensured was technically indistinguishable from a standard human broadcast. 90 seconds of a piano piece that Chen had chosen, something her grandmother had played. 38 seconds of something Ibarra had recorded on his phone from a street musician in the city where he'd grown up a year before the war. A minute of something that had been popular in the months just before the Vethkari arrived, that had been on every speaker in every space Alara had inhabited during that last normal year, so associated with the feeling of before that she had avoided it for 3 years. And then, in the week of choosing, had sat with it and found it still present, still true, still, against all reason, beautiful. 30 seconds of Brace's choice, which he refused to name but which turned out to be, when the package was played at the test broadcast level, a kind of old country song that had clearly been very important to him at some specific point in his life, and about which he said absolutely nothing, and would not take questions. The Vethkari received this transmission and did what they always did with human communications traffic. They attempted to decode it, to identify its function, to place it in the correct catalog entry. They could not. Music is not a signal. It is not information in any operational sense. It encodes nothing that can be extracted into a military framework. It is not strategy, not command, not coordination. It exists in a register of meaning that is not translatable to systems built around the question of what a communication is for. The Vethkari collective intelligence spent 11 minutes and 34 seconds attempting to categorize a piano piece and a street musician, recording and a song that had been #1 on the charts for 3 weeks in a year that now seemed very far away. During those 11 minutes and 34 seconds, it broadcast its full network map. Seath read it in 8 minutes and 12 seconds. She was sitting in a converted equipment locker in the northern facility, her rebuilt relay interface covering most of the available workspace, her face lit by the blue-white of its displays. She was wearing the same worn thermal layer she'd had on for 36 hours because she hadn't left the station in that time. When the network map finished loading all of it, every relay node, every communication path in the Vethkari infrastructure across the entire Eastern Theater, she sat very still for a moment. Then she said, into the open channel, "I have it." She said it the way you might say, "I found it." In a library after a long search. Quiet, precise, slightly wondering. Alara, monitoring from the operations center, said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then she said, "How complete is it?" "Complete," Seath said. "What's your confidence?" 100% on the major nodes. High 90s on the secondary mesh. There a pause. 17 relay stations in this map that are not in any intelligence database we have access to. 17 stations we didn't know existed. Alara looked at the display in front of her. The network map was still building visually. Nodes appearing, paths between them lighting up, the full architecture of how the Vethkari collective intelligence maintained its coherence across hundreds of kilometers and thousands of individual units becoming legible for the first time. It was, she thought, genuinely beautiful, in the specific way that complex systems were beautiful. The elegance of it, the way every element supported every other element, the clear evidence of intelligence in the design. Not human intelligence, but intelligence. Real and deep and ancient. She let herself look at it for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she started working. In the after-action documentation, this was described as the broadcast operation. It was also described, in the notes Alara wrote for the working group record, as the moment she became certain they were going to win. Not because of the network map. That was tactically significant, but not decisive. Because of the 11 minutes and 34 seconds. Because of what those 11 minutes meant about the limits of a library. A library contains what has been encountered. It contains, by definition, only the known. Music was not in the library. Not because the Vethkari had never heard it. They'd been monitoring human communication for years. But because they had never been able to place it. It wasn't signal, wasn't noise, wasn't tactical. It didn't fit any entry. It was in the framework of a species whose cognition was organized around purpose and function and accumulated categorization. Inexplicable. Humans had been producing inexplicable things for as long as they'd had hands and voices. Tens of thousands of years of making things that served no immediate survival purpose. Things that were beautiful or funny or comforting or terrifying and this was the specific category the Vethkari had no entry for. Things that were important for reasons that couldn't be fully articulated but were, somehow, real. This was not a weapon. It was something older than weapons. It was what you did when you were alive and you knew you were alive, and you wanted there to be some record of that. Some mark in the air that said, here, this mattered, this was true. The next 14 months were not easy. Nothing about the war was easy, and the working group's operations, now expanded, now distributed across 3 theaters, now networked into a web of units applying variants of the same principle in different contexts, produced results that were significant and costly, both. The network map gave them the relay infrastructure in full. The disinformation campaign built on that map degraded Vethkari tactical coherence progressively exactly as Osi had projected. The adaptive response of the Vethkari, because they did adapt. Alara was never under any illusion about that, generated new problems as fast as old ones were resolved, and sometimes faster. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted. The Vethkari had entered this war confident in their library. They had understood it, going in, as a war of containment, not of conquest, not of extermination, but of management, of bringing a threshold species to heal before it became fully capable, of acting quickly and decisively before it was too late. They had, by the middle of the 5th year, manifestly not managed this. and the intelligence assessment Osei's team was translating showed something significant. The language the Vethkari were using about humanity had changed. Not the tactical language, the fundamental language. The category they had placed humans in was, quietly, being revised. The threshold species was not behaving like a species that had not crossed the threshold. The Vethkari command was confronting, in their data, an entity that was not quite what their catalog predicted. It was still a war. People were still dying. The cost was still being carried, in the weight-bearing way, by everyone who was part of it. Elara did not minimize this, but she had come, over 5 years, to understand something about herself and about the thing she was part of, the specific human thing, the adaptive, improvising, argument with data thing that she had not had words for at the beginning. She had come to understand that this was not, at its core, a military story. It was not primarily a story about weapons or tactics or organizational efficiency, though it involved all of those. It was a story about what happened when a species that could not be fully categorized was subjected to a system designed to categorize everything. The system failed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulating way that precise instruments fail when they are asked to measure something they were not designed to measure. The error range increased. The confidence intervals widened. The predictions diverged from the observations. And the species, the uncategorizable one, the one whose library was full of contradictions, and whose historical record was a chain of problems, creating other problems, and whose every effort at optimization eventually produced something unexpected. That species kept moving. Not because they were better, not in any cosmic or absolute sense, because they were different. Because the specific quality of human difference, the improvisation, the novelty, the capacity to look at a constraint and see a variable, was not something that could be added to the Vethkari library. You cannot catalog the capacity to generate things that aren't in the catalog. The ceasefire was reached at the end of the 5th year of the war. It was not a victory in the classical sense. The Vethkari were not defeated, not in the sense of having their capacity reduced below operational capability. They were still there, still present, still the most technologically advanced civilization humans had encountered. The terms of the ceasefire acknowledged this. They also acknowledged something that had not been in any pre-war Vethkari framework, that humanity had demonstrated attributes that placed it in a different legal category under the Interstellar Compact. Not managed, not contained, something else. The word in the Compact's language translated imperfectly as recognized. Elara received the news in the working group's offices in the Northern Complex. It came through Seath's communication system, authenticated by Hata's personal code, and Seath read it aloud in the spare, factual way Seath read everything. And then there was a moment in which no one spoke. Then Brace said, "Right," and Park said, "Good." And Chen looked at the ceiling for a few seconds and then said, "Now what?" What followed was a long conversation, the kind that went on for most of an evening and covered a great deal of ground. At one point, Abara went and found a bottle of something that no one asked about the provenance of, and it was passed around, and that was how the ceasefire was processed by the people in that room. Not with ceremony, not with speeches, but with tired people sitting in a room that smelled of recycled air and asking each other practical questions about what came next. Hata arrived 2 hours in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the group. The accumulated evidence of what 5 years had done to all of them, and also the evidence of what 5 years had built. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, it was one sentence. "Good work," he said. It was the right thing to say, not effusive, not grand, not untrue. "What happens to the program?" Elara asked. "That's a negotiation question," Hata said. "The compact requires joint review of military assets. The working group is," he paused, choosing words, "going to be an interesting item on that review list." "Are they going to understand what it is?" Chen said. "No," Hata said. "But that's probably all right. It means they won't know what to do about it." "They'll categorize it," Osi said, from the corner, with a slight, exhausted smile. "And get it wrong." "Yes," Hata agreed. "And we'll continue doing whatever we're actually doing regardless." The bottle went around again. Outside, the Northern Complex was quiet in a way it had not been in a very long time. The specific quiet of a facility in which the operational tempo had stopped, suddenly, like a motor cutting out. It would take days before anyone's nervous system fully accepted it. Some people, Elara knew from history, never fully accepted it. They came home from wars and found that the quiet didn't fit the shape they'd become. She thought about that. She thought about Theorem and Mrs. Adekunle and the letters in the waterproof pouch and the lab and the specific smell of the fabrication space and what it would mean to go back to any of that. Whether going back was the right frame for it, or whether what was actually happening was going forward into something that hadn't existed before the war and would be built, slowly and imperfectly, from the rubble of what had. She thought about the Vethkari, their beautiful network, the elegance of their collective intelligence, the ancient depth of their library. She thought about what it meant to be recognized by a civilization that had spent 5 years trying to put you in a box and discovered the box didn't fit. She thought about the 11 minutes and 34 seconds, about a piano piece and a street musician and Brace's country song hanging in the air over a planet at war, inexplicable in any framework that didn't already understand what they were. She thought, we made that. We made that for no reason except that we had to. We have been making things like that, things that serve no operational purpose, things that are just important, since before we had metal or fire or written language, since we were something that sat in the dark and painted the walls and wasn't sure why but did it anyway. You cannot make a library entry for that. You cannot categorize the act of making things that matter for reasons that can't be fully articulated. You cannot contain a species whose most characteristic behavior is to reach towards something just outside its own understanding. The Vethkari had tried. They were, she thought, not terrible, not monsters, not evil in the simple sense, but very old and very confident in their accumulated knowledge, and that confidence had been the shape of the problem. The certainty that everything could be known, catalogued, and managed. The certainty that threshold species were manageable. They had been wrong about that. They had been wrong in a way that took 5 years and enormous cost to demonstrate, and they had demonstrated the capacity to recognize that they were wrong, which was, she thought, worth something. Not everything, but something. The bottle reached Elara. She held it for a moment, thinking about all of this, and then she took a small drink and passed it to Seath, and Seath passed it to Park. And Park looked at it for a moment and said, very quietly, my father would have found this interesting. The war or the ceasefire, Brace said. All of it, Park said. The way the ground tells you what's under it if you know how to listen. He always said that. I thought he meant geology. A pause. He might have meant everything. No one had anything to add to that, which was as it should be. What followed was a long process, the work of years and decades rather than months, of 2 civilizations that had been at war, trying to understand each other rather than contain each other. A process that had no single architect and no clean resolution and no catalog entry, because it was the kind of problem that was too human, in its construction, to fit. Elara was part of that process. So were Osi and Seath and Park and Chen and Brace and Vasquez and Hada and many others across many theaters, all of them carrying the war at its actual weight, and also carrying the thing that came after the war at its actual weight, which was different and in some ways heavier, and in some ways lighter. Mrs. Adekunle had kept Theorem. The letters were still in the waterproof pouch, but she had written more since, and Elara read them all in one sitting, the morning after the ceasefire, in the gray light of the Northern Facilities common room, a cup of terrible coffee going cold beside her. Theorem was elderly now, Mrs. Adekunle reported, and somewhat deaf, and spent most of his time in the sunniest window of the apartment. He had, she said, been very patient about the whole situation. She did not go back to materials engineering. Not precisely. What she did was closer to what she had always done, standing in front of problems that had no existing solution, and asking the questions that eventually produced them. The context was different. The questions were different. The feeling of a problem yielding to the right question was the same. She thought, sometimes, about the 11 minutes and 34 seconds, about the Vethkari collective intelligence, spending 11 minutes trying to categorize a piano piece and a street musician and Brace's country song. She thought about what it meant that those 11 minutes had mattered, tactically, operationally, in the course of an interstellar war. She thought about what it meant that the thing which had mattered was not a weapon or a strategy, but the simple, inexplicable, ancient, categorically uncontainable human act of making something beautiful for no purpose that could be extracted into a military framework. It seemed like the right ending for a story about libraries, or the right beginning of a story about something else. Somewhere in the northern facility, Seath was building another tool. She hadn't explained it yet. Elara had learned to trust Seath's silence on work in progress. She made herself a cup of the coffee that tasted like coffee in the technical sense, and she sat down at her desk and she began.